So you're just driving along, everything feels fine, and then bam, that little orange light you never want to see pops up on your dash, the check engine light. You get home, you plug in a scanner, and it gives you this code, P0700. So what on earth does that mean? Well, let's decode exactly what your Chevy or GMC is trying to tell you.
See, this isn't just some random computer glitch. That P0700 code is a very specific message. It's a signal that something inside one of the most complicated parts of your vehicle, the transmission, really needs your attention. Think of it like a newspaper headline. Our job here is to figure out the rest of the story.
Okay, so what is it technically? Well, the P0700 is what we call a generic trouble code. It means that the transmission control module, you can just call it the TCM, has spotted a problem. The TCM is basically the brain of your automatic transmission, and it's its job to make sure everything is shifting smoothly. So when it sends a P0700, it's just raising its hand and yelling, "Hey, we've got a problem down here."
But, and this is the most important part, the P0700 code itself is just the messenger. It doesn't tell you what the specific problem is. All it's saying is that the TCM has found another, more specific code. So the key takeaway here is that P0700 is almost always going to show up with other codes that will actually point you to what's really wrong.
All right, so you've got the code. What do you do now? First off, don't panic. But you do need to act kind of quickly. So let's walk through the very first steps you should take to start digging into this. First things first, you absolutely need a good scan tool. And I don't mean just any old code reader. You need one that can specifically read transmission codes. This is non-negotiable because you're on the hunt for those other, more detailed codes we just talked about. Once you have those, the next, and maybe the easiest and most important check, is your transmission fluid.
And this is exactly why you always start with the simple stuff. Before you start thinking about replacing expensive parts, just check the fluid. Is the level low? Does it look really dark and dirty or maybe smell burnt? You know, low or nasty fluid is a super common cause of transmission issues, and it can totally be the reason the TCM is sending out an alert. It's such a simple check that could save you a massive headache. Okay, so let's say your fluid looks great. Well, our investigation isn't over yet. Now, we move on to the next level. We're going to start tracking down some of the most common culprits, from the vehicle's wiring to its sensors.
Generally, the potential causes are going to fall into one of three buckets. First, you've got faulty sensors that are feeding bad information to the TCM. Second, you could have problems with the wiring itself, the stuff that connects everything. And then third, you have the more serious stuff, actual internal transmission faults. We'll go through these in that order, from easiest to check to the most complex.
You see, the TCM relies on a whole network of sensors to make its decisions, and, some of them fail more often than others. The input and output speed sensors, a huge point of failure. If they're sending conflicting data about how fast things are spinning, the TCM just gets confused and throws that P0700 code. Same thing goes for the range sensor. If it's telling the TCM you're in drive when you're actually in reverse, well, you can imagine that's a big problem. Now, if the sensors are the eyes and ears of the system, the wiring is the nervous system. On a lot of these Chevy and GMC trucks, the main wiring harness for the TCM is located right behind the battery. And think about it, that area gets tons of vibration, heat, and moisture. That makes bad connections, corroded pins, or shorted wires a really common issue. So a careful visual inspection right there is an absolutely crucial step.
All right, now for a weird one. A less common culprit, but I've seen it reported. Could a weak alternator be the cause? I know, it sounds strange, right? But modern transmissions rely so heavily on a stable electrical supply to work correctly. If your alternator isn't putting out enough voltage, it can cause all sorts of electronic gremlins, including confusing the TCM enough to trigger a P0700 code. It's rare, for sure, but it's something to keep in your back pocket if you are totally stumped.
So we've checked the fluid, we've looked at the sensors and the wiring. If you're still on the hunt for the problem, well, it might be time to consider that the issue is something a little deeper, something inside the transmission itself. And yeah, this is where things get a bit more complex. A bad shift solenoid, which is basically a little electronic valve that directs the fluid, is a really common internal failure. The problem could also be the valve body, that's the maze-like control center where all the solenoids live, or it could be an issue with the torque converter. And finally, although it's way less common, the TCM itself can just go bad. But that should always be your last resort after you've ruled out everything else.
This chart here really helps put it all into perspective. You can see that a huge chunk of P0700 issues come from those simple fluid checks and the more common electrical and sensor problems. The more serious internal mechanical faults are a smaller but still significant piece of the pie. And those really rare causes, like a bad TCM or alternator, that's the smallest slice for a reason. So when you're diagnosing, always start with the biggest slices of the pie first.
So, we have covered a lot of ground here. What does this all mean for you right now, with that light staring at you from the dash? Let's boil everything we've talked about down into one clear final action plan.
I want you to think of your diagnosis like a funnel. You start wide at the top by scanning for all the codes to get your clues. Then you start to narrow it down, checking the easy, common things first, your fluid and your wiring. Still no luck? Then you move on to testing specific sensors. Only then do you start looking into those deeper internal components. And, always remember step 5. If you get in over your head, there is absolutely no shame in consulting a professional.
And that leads us to our final and most critical takeaway. I'm going to leave you with this direct quote from our source material because it is just that important. P0700 indicates a serious issue. You should stop driving and get it diagnosed to prevent further damage. This is not a code you want to ignore and just hope it goes away. Continuing to drive could turn a small problem into a catastrophic and really expensive transmission failure. So the final question isn't just what's wrong, but maybe more importantly, how quickly can I get this figured out?